The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 1631, Contemplation. More than the question, the thing that bugged Lex was the fact that he would have to wait for Little Blue to receive his heritage. He had no idea how long that would take, and the mysterious being that could control his entire existence as well as probably this jungle did not seem like it would be open to negotiations about speeding things up. Lex looked, not at the figure, but at this strange land. It felt nothing like Abaddon at all. If Lex had not known better, he would have assumed that this was just another place in the normal universe. To be entirely honest, the thing that Lex was tempted to ask the most was how they had been able to isolate Abaddon's aura, creating a safe haven for themselves. For a long, long time he had been searching for a place where he might be able to create the Midnight Castle, an entity that could exist independently of the Midnight Inn. He wanted to place it somewhere extremely hidden, so that it could act as his secret hideout-cum-safe house. He wanted to find such a place to hide the Chamber of Rebirth there, so that if ever he encountered a situation where he was overcome or defeated, he would be able to save himself. The whole purpose of such a safe house would be so that his revival wouldn't be detected, and he could recover in secret without alerting whoever his enemy would be. From the very moment he arrived at Abaddon, a place also known as the Graveyard of Secrets, he felt like this place might suit his needs. At least, in terms of being disconnected and not easily accessible from the rest of the universe fit his criteria. But building a safe house here wasn't so simple. Finding a way to isolate the aura of Abaddon would be only the first step. He would need to gather the resources to build the Midnight Castle, actually build it, isolate an area from Abaddon's aura, find a way to avoid being attacked by the many creatures that filled this place, and do it all secretly so that none other would detect it. The challenges he would face were not few if he decided to go along with this plan. But then again, this was only just one of the things he had been planning, and it wasn't necessary that he ask them a question related to that. For example, Lex got the feeling that the being in front of him could see through him entirely. If that was the case, Lex really wanted to ask about the strange seal in his forehead. Earlier on, he felt like reaching the Heaven Immortal realm might be enough for him to unravel it and learn its secrets. Yet now that he was close to the Heaven Immortal realm, Lex felt like the danger from it had not reduced at all. The issue was how ambiguous the instructions regarding the seal were. He faced unpredictable situations every day, and he didn't want to go around carrying a seal with something that could kill him as soon as it unraveled. After all, these days, he also had a foe who could cause him to fall into cultivation deviation at a moment's notice. If one such incident caused his seal to open, then he was as good as dead. Then again, he could also ask more about karma, or the secret of becoming a Tao Lord. He felt like the being in front of him was most definitely, probably a Tao Lord. Or something even above that. Maybe. Who knew? Not him. Seeing as how the being did not rush him to ask any questions, Lex first hesitated, and then sat down. He closed his eyes and began to clear his head, going over his options one by one and in great detail. While there were many things he wanted to learn about, there were also things he needed to learn about, such as how to find the chalice of the abandoned. In a situation such as this, Lex had to gamble. He would need to carefully evaluate the importance of what he needed to know urgently, and the things he wanted to know. Lex would have to speculate on whether he would be able to fulfill his needs on his own, such as guess the validity of his own theories regarding Abaddon and the chalice, and his own ability to fulfill the additional quests he had set up for himself. He needed to consider which was more important to him long-term, and which ones he could risk falling back on in terms of progress. This was a decision Lex was taking incredibly seriously, so much so that he entered into the state of flow. Though the ability no longer provided him with immense benefits, as he had much better control over himself, even the slightest advantage could help in this situation. The figure said nothing during this time, simply watching. What was a few hours or days or even centuries to a being that has lived through entire ages? Lex didn't only contemplate. He also looked over the inn. He watched as Liz made friends and enjoyed the environment of the inn. He watched his guests come and go. Lex watched as more and more joined Obsidian, and helplessly looked at the service to increase their system rank. He thought about his goals, his revenge that needed to be sought, his useless parents somewhere in the universe. He thought about Mary, and how she had died despite having a system and being a Dow Lord. There wasn't a single facet of his life he didn't think about, and considered how important things were. Lex had never thought about his life so deeply before, and discovered that he actually learned a thing or two about his own life. But more importantly, he discovered that being so meticulous didn't really suit him. Sure, Lex no longer wanted to make silly mistakes, and wanted to plan out his moves before making them lest he end up in trouble. But the thing was, he didn't mind a little trouble now and then. More importantly, getting so caught up in the right action was a form of living in fear, and if there was one thing Lex wasn't, it was a coward. Even in his earliest days, when he was chased down by zombies, Lex hadn't been a coward. Sure, he ran like heck. But the moment he was healed, he started to think about how to go right back. So, instead of pondering what the right question was, Lex picked the question he wanted to ask the most, and just went with it. Chapter 1632, Nexus. When Lex opened his eyes, he had regained his vigor and confidence. Even in the face of a being so powerful he could not even try to comprehend its power level, he was not servile. Sure, he was respectful. But even understanding that his entire existence depended on this being's whim, Lex did not feel fear. Just like those early days of the inn, where he was pathetically weak yet traveling to new worlds filled him with excitement, when Lex thought about just how many mysteries and secrets filled the universe, he felt grateful, not overwhelmed. If the universe weren't such an interesting place, he might have gotten bored with it. It was the mystery, the history, the richness and depth of the universe that gave him a tingly feeling inside. It almost felt like lactose intolerance. I am not sure about the details of what you can answer, so excuse me if my question seems inappropriate. Abaddon, I heard, is called the graveyard of secrets. Since it is so difficult to reach, and as a result of how peculiar its existence is, it is the perfect place to hide a secret. But, despite having excellent qualities for exactly this, for certain reasons it does not suit my needs. How can I find a place within the universe that is isolated from all methods of probing, yet is safe and stable enough for me to hide a secret? Basically, all the secrecy of Abaddon, but with a touch of stability. The figure, too, did not immediately answer. Instead, it stared at Lex for a moment. Mrs. Big Fat Guy hadn't been literal when she said he only had one question. He could have asked her about the parameters of what he could ask, and she would not have counted that as his one main question. Then again, she did not want to present herself as friendly and approachable, so perhaps this misunderstanding was for the best. There should always be a level of mystery and respect between beings of such vastly differing power levels, so she let it slide. One of the greatest lies in the universe is predictable patterns, she finally said, her voice echoing in Lex's mind, instantly causing him to fall into another trance. He would comprehend not only the exact information she would give him, but also all affiliated or associated topics. This was a small gift from her to him, in the hopes that he would continue to remain a loyal friend to the Kuan-Pung known as Little Blue. The Kuan-Pung race was actually one of the strongest races in the universe. In fact, their staple food was dragons. But while weakness is akin to a sin, sometimes being too powerful can also have repercussions. It was not without reason that the weaker races of the universe still existed, and were prevailing, while the strongest few, the primordials and mythic beings, not to mention others, had become a rare sight. It was exactly because the Kuan-Pung were so much stronger than others that it caused many in the universe to band together to eliminate them. Of course, this was ancient history, and was irrelevant these days. She just hoped that if Little Blue ever attracted the envy of others, this human would continue to be a loyal companion. Almost all existence within the universe is based on realms. There are minor realms, major realms, pocket realms, and so on. In fact, many consider the void to be the opposite of a realm, or an anti-realm. Almost all life in the universe is concentrated within realms, or in the void, forming a pattern. It is almost as if any collection of stable space can be considered a realm. That, however, is not true. Like I said, all predictable patterns are a lie. There is only one unbroken pattern in this universe, and that is messing with time is a one-way ticket to death. But even that is not without reason, it's just that few qualify to even know there is a reason, let alone understand what that reason is. But that is another topic entirely. Coming back to realms. What is a realm? A realm is basically a foundation, or a canvas, for the laws of the universe to weave fundamental realities, contained within a boundary. The boundary is just as important to a realm as the way in which the laws of that individual realm manifest. That is because the universe is full of chaos energy, and chaos energy cannot be used by 99.99% of all living entities within the universe. The boundary wall of a realm absorbs chaos energy, and refines it for its own use and operations, leaving behind any number of distilled and purified energies that are a lot more stable than chaos energy. Basically, a realm boundary is the mitochondria of a realm, meaning, it is the powerhouse. It is the source of all energy within the realm. As such, almost all realm boundaries have great similarities, which is one of the fundamental reasons why the existence of a realm cannot be hidden in the universe. Even if the exact location of a realm cannot be determined, the existence of its boundary wall has a certain influence on the chaos energy of the universe, leaving an unmistakable trail. So then, to find a location that is undetectable and untraceable, the first thing you have to look for is a place that breaks this pattern. Do not think these things are rare. If we go by percentage, then yes, the existence of places that break this pattern is probably less than 0.001%. If we go by numerics, however, then there should be thousands if not tens of thousands. Of these places, I will tell you of the one I am most familiar with. It is a place known as Nexus. Nexus is not a realm, and the closest thing I can compare it to is a prison, though technically it is not that either. It just so happens, however, that within the Nexus, every 100,000 years or so, an item is born and is trapped. Eventually, however, that item escapes the Nexus, which is basically the only time the Nexus is detectable. However, you don't need to worry. It is unlikely that any living being in the universe is still aware of the Nexus. That is because their attention is usually diverted towards that item. Oracles and diviners believe that the birth of that item causes a great change in fate and destiny or some such nonsense. If only they knew the truth, how anticlimactic that would be. Anyway, the Nexus is the perfect place for you, based on your needs. Like I said, no one in the universe, other than I, and now you, know about its existence. Now all you need to do is find it. Don't worry, I'll tell you how. Chapter 1633, You couldn't possibly stir up the universe. As Lex listened to the figure talk about Nexus, a place where he could hide from all forms of divination and tracing, he recalled what Vera had told him about the Nexus event. It was funny how the same thing represented two entirely different things to two people. According to what Vera told him, a Nexus event was forthcoming in the near future, though no one knew the exact time and date of when a Nexus event would occur, nor could it be determined beforehand. It was a time of great significance. During a Nexus event, destiny could be changed, oracles could see into the future without repercussion, and they could even remove the punishments weighing them down from their previous attempts to look into the future. The most important thing, at least for Vera and the other oracles, was that during a Nexus event many could change their fates. Lex personally did not feel too constricted by fate, but those who had foreseen their own fates seemed to fear it a whole lot. It was a critically important event for which many oracles were planning and plotting some things, to the point where there seemed to be a shortage of diviners in many places. Now, though, the information he was getting seemed to reveal some of the secrets behind why the Nexus event was such a big deal. It appeared as though the real secret of the event had to do with the item and the place, rather than anything else. The timeline for the release of the item from Nexus is unpredictable. It could happen tomorrow, or in 10,000 years. But since it is only discoverable when the item escapes, it seems like Nexus does not suit your needs. In truth, that is not the case because the timing for that item's release can be controlled. I will now teach you how to induce the release of the item from Nexus, how to locate Nexus when it happens, how to mark its location so you can access it in the future, and how to get to it. Actually completing all those requirements will be your own headache. Lex did not answer, partially because he didn't want to interrupt, but also because he was still mostly in a trance. The only reason he could have a few random thoughts was only because those thoughts helped him understand the subject better. I told you earlier that Nexus is similar to a prison, and that is because it traps the item born within for as long as possible. The item is different in shape and function each time, but it is born from the same way. Throughout the universe, every major and minor event that occurs has a consequence. Whether it is karmic, or along the lines of destiny, or through the application of other, deep laws, they all have consequences that reverberate throughout the entire universe. If a butterfly flaps its wings in the primary realm, then some minuscule effect is felt even in the farthest corners of the void. Yet the nature of the Nexus is such that it wants to remain isolated from the universe, and everything that occurs within. As a result, all the energy, all the karma, all the fate and divinity or anything else that targets it as a result of something that happened in the universe is collected and concentrated, until it eventually forms an item. The more significant the events happening during a certain period of time, the quicker that item will be born. Similarly, the more energy directed towards the Nexus, the quicker that item will be born. I don't expect you to have any means to cause any significant events happening on a universal scale, so I will teach you a means to direct energy towards the Nexus. Lex's eyes flickered for a moment, and the figure caught it. She found it hard to believe that the puny human in front of it had any means of causing a stir on a universal scale. Although he seemed like he was thinking about it, she paid it no mind and continued to teach him how to channel energy towards the Nexus. Following that, she began to teach him how he could locate the Nexus, and how he was supposed to travel to and fro from it once he had found it. The process was not quick. Days went by as the figure expounded on the topic, going into necessary detail and allowing Lex to grasp the intricacies of the required task. The Nexus, as a place that broke the pattern of realms across the universe, was very much an abnormal and abstract place. Without the proper insight and awareness, it would be impossible to even conceive its existence, let alone find it. Lex had mostly traveled through the universe, either through the inn or through the resources of massive organizations that had existed in the universe for eons. He had never, himself, traveled the void, nor had he ever found a realm on his own. If he wanted to find the Nexus, he would have to do both, and so there was much to learn. Although he had only asked about how to locate a place similar to Abaddon, the blurry figure included all knowledge that he would need to access Nexus within her explanation. It was as if she could detect where he lacked, and expounded on it on her own. It took 13 days for the process to be complete, and once she was done, Lex was teleported back to the Midnight Castle without realizing it at all. He did not stir, for his enlightenment continued. Within the Midnight Inn, the armies had already begun to wake, and were one by one awarded their prizes. Although Lex hadn't been able to find extravagant prizes for them from the jungle, he'd already selected prizes from the system panel for their armies. To be truthful, however, they would not have minded even if there was no prize, for the mist itself had affected them immensely. The regal twig of majestic excellence, however, was handed over to the Deathsworn family, who treated it with the utmost reverence, and acted as if they had received the greatest reward possible. The inn staff only found that to be natural, but if Lex had been conscious of what was happening, he would have found their reactions off, and would have wondered if he missed something about the twig. Chapter 1634, Challenge Accepted. Lex opened his eyes slowly, as if waking up from the most relaxing siesta of his life. He found himself in a random bedroom within the Midnight Castle, and immediately sensed that the castle was still full of celestial-level guests. His mind went to Little Blue and Fenrir. He genuinely had no idea how long it would take for them to get free, but he had a feeling it would not be quick. If that was the case, then he needed to make the most of his time and use it productively. Fortunately, Abaddon did not cut his connection to the Midnight Inn. Through his projections and his system, he could still run it safely, while working on his plans in Abaddon in the meantime. He got up and found his way to Cayman, who was drinking malt from a soup dish and regaling a firefly with stories of home. And then we started roasting marshmallows, but the marshmallows were incredibly insidious, and hid within their wafer houses. Fortunately, my fire was strong enough to deal with the unexpected hurdle, or that would have been one very disappointing bonfire. These marshmallows you speak of, they sound very tactical and enlightened. A formidable foe to look out for in the future, said the firefly. Very unlike the humans who inhabit this castle. I fail to see the tactical advantages of their actions. Do you know they wrap their feet in fabric and call it fashion? How absurd. If you think that's strange, wait till I tell you about. Cayman, who was excitedly sharing some news with the firefly, suddenly turned towards Lex, as if he had just spotted him. He suddenly wore a guilty look, as if he had been caught doing something he shouldn't have. It's good to see you're enjoying yourself, said Lex as he walked up to the magma lion. I hate to take you away, but do you have a moment to spare? There's a few things we need to discuss. Of course, of course. Excuse me, Professor Burns, I'll be right back, Cayman said to the firefly, who did not seem to mind the interruption. I didn't expect to see you so soon. I heard you were gravely wounded and would be healing for a while, Cayman said, though there was a hint of doubt in his tone. I was injured, but I've since healed, Lex said dismissively. I have an update on our scouting party. There's good news and there's bad news. Bad news first, Cayman said, his expression turning solemn. The bad news is that we may be stuck in this jungle for a long time. It's hard to say. The good news is that the scouting party ended up encountering a huge opportunity, and are in the process of receiving it. Until they're done, we won't be able to leave, even if we want to. Cayman raised his eyebrow. That news was not nearly as bad as he was expecting to hear, all things considered. Even so, it was definitely odd, and a huge speed bump to their mission. Can you tell me why we won't be able to leave? Cayman asked. Not that I'm willing to leave a man behind, but I'd just like to know. Oh, that's an easy one. It's because the incredibly powerful being that is giving them the opportunity won't allow us to leave until they're done. I don't know about you, but I don't really have the confidence to go against one of the powers of this jungle. When phrased like that, Cayman realized that they were genuinely stuck. Although they did not know what had happened outside, he had witnessed multiple Tao lords with his own eyes. Even by Abaddon's standards, this place was unusual. Well, that's not necessarily bad news. The condottiere wants a tree sapling from this forest, and it won't be so easy to get our hands on it according to some of the new guests I've talked to in the castle. This might be a good opportunity for us to heal up completely and explore the jungle a little, and harvest some of the resources here. I'm glad you're taking things positively, said Lex. I'll admit, I was a little bummed about having to spend some time here. But this might help me find a way to locate the chalice quicker, so I don't mind. The two talked for a while longer, discussing their plans, before splitting up. If they were going to be settled here for a while, then it would be best to make the most of their situation. But as Lex left, Cayman looked at him with squinted eyes. Z had told him about how Lex was secretly a powerful badass, hiding his true cultivation level. Cayman didn't believe him, because Lex should not have been able to hide it from Abaddon. Or so he thought, because he remembered how wounded Lex appeared to be last time they saw each other. Now he was just fine. Such a thing was not so easy to explain. Lex sensed the doubt from Cayman, but didn't pay it much attention. Instead, he thought about the many system prompts he had gotten about items that could help the system repair itself. Although those notifications were inside the inner jungle, who was to say the outer jungle was also devoid of them? He could use this time to search for such items. Also, the blurry figure seemed to doubt that Lex had the ability to stir things up on a universal level. He couldn't explain why he felt so offended by something that should have been common sense. All he knew was that if it was a challenge, then the challenge was officially accepted. Within the Jolly Rancher, Jack opened his eyes. Their journey was about to come to an end. They were about to arrive at the Artica realm accompanied by 7 Tao Lord dragons. Tiny Sparkles, Jack called out to his first mate. Find me Bob. I have a task for him. Chapter 1635, Cataclysmic Coolness. Jack sat within the Jolly Rancher, having spent most of his trip in deep meditation. The disgusting potent stench of cursed karma had been temporarily removed, finally giving him the opportunity to rest and recover. Yet he knew that it was very much a temporary thing. As long as he stayed with the dragons, the stench would be suppressed, but as soon as they separated, the stench would return. Unfortunately, despite his ever-deepening insight into karma, he had no way to remove the curse, or even to prevent himself from being affected by the smell. Even though fairies seemed pretty magical, their powers had failed Jack in this endeavor. But he was not without hope. He had a feeling that reaching the immortal realm would be an important threshold for him, and might just give him the power he needed to resolve this issue, even if it only meant resolving the symptom instead of the problem. Jack stopped thinking about the future, and instead turned his attention to the recent past. The blurry figure who had seen through so much of Lex, as if he were an open book, possibly even knowing about his system, seemed to be unable to see the details of his life. It hadn't known about him being the Innkeeper, or the position of the Midnight Inn in the universe, budding as it was. It also seemed unable to see the connection between Jack and Lex. This, Jack found peculiar. Even the 7 dragons, as powerful as they were, could not see into that connection. Lex wasn't sure why their connection was a secret, but he deeply appreciated it. But since the being could not see the details of Lex's life, it only made sense that it would underestimate his influence, or ability to cause chaos. Jack was ruminating on his immediate future, about how he could focus on setting up the Nexus. He had no intentions of doing it as Lex. He wanted to keep Lex as far away from his secret hideout as possible, and that was the primary reason why he didn't choose to use Abaddon to hide his base. After all, despite how secretive it was, there were thousands of beings who knew Lex had been to Abaddon. Regardless of how difficult it was to find, if he ever faced a formidable foe, it would be easy for them to find out that Lex had spent time there. Considering that he frequently faced Dao Lords, Lex was preparing a safe house that could hide even from them. Obviously, that was easier said than done, but that did not bother him. The door to his room opened, and Jack looked towards the person who had just entered. Ever since they joined the 7 dragons, the karmic stench wasn't Jack's only problem that seemed solved. The greatest other problem they solved was that Jack and the others did not need to worry about what Bob said, nor did they need to worry about Goldilocks turning everything into gold, nor did they need to worry about the crystal alligator turning everything into crystal. It was quite refreshing, but also a little disappointing. Lex was always the one who had crazy things happening to him, and Jack was the one who brought the crazy with him. Without the constant nonsense, it was a little boring. For a moment, Jack thought about what he had learned about his crew, from the dragons no less. Pebbles, the hamster, had somehow attained both immortality and invincibility, in exchange for obtaining any other kind of power. As such, he genuinely only had the strength of a real hamster despite his cultivation level. His teeth were pretty powerful though. Goldilocks and the crystal alligator were physical elementals with normal functioning bodies, which didn't make sense since elementals were beings made up only of the element they were associated with. Monk, the bear cub, had somehow hijacked every story about bear cubs in the universe and targeted them towards itself. That meant that sooner or later, as long as he didn't die, he would become pretty strong, or so he thought. Unfortunately, all stories involving bear cubs always depicted the cub as weak, and so Monk was weak. Now he needed to find other ways to grow his strength. Longbeard, the gnome with a beard longer than its body, had a long beard so hard he literally couldn't cut it at all. Oddly, it was only his beard hair that had this unique trait. Then there was Bob. Good old Bob. Not only did he have multiple titles as a deity, which was rare yet not unheard of, he was the deity of entropy, which was, according to modern colloquial English, OP as foo dash. After all, having power over entropy gave him access to chaos energy. But, apparently, that's not how Bob used his power. Instead, he used his authority to spread chaos and disorder with his words, affecting the laws of probability to make whatever he said, regardless of how improbable, probable. "Oh, thank the Lord you're in a better mood, Captain," Bob exclaimed, rushing in towards Jack. "Thou hast a heart of gold. To think you'd go out of your way to give a ride to 7 orphan dragons to another realm, your compassion falls onto us like water from a particularly high waterfall. I must sing your ballad throughout the land." Let it be known, let it be roared across the heavens and whispered in the deepest corners of forgotten realms, that the captain, yes the captain, is no mere mortal soul. Nay. He is a titan of tenacity, a maestro of the miraculous. For who but he, in all the spiraling worlds, would dare, I say, to offer passage to 7, not 6, but 7 dwarf dragons, each blazing with majesty and molten mystery, and ferry them gallantly to their destined realm? Oh, what courage! What compassion! What completely cataclysmic coolness! What dash! All right, I get it, Jack interrupted Bob, feeling quite good about his cataclysmic coolness. Maybe he should let Bob talk more often. I have a mission for you, a mission that only you can do. Chapter 1636, Burdened with Glorious Purpose. The air was thick with palpable tension, an air of solemnity filling the wooden room. Magenta lights flickered from the lanterns, dancing across the room, only adding to the seriousness of the situation. Or so Bob imagined. Since he was partially colorblind, he had no idea what magenta looked like, and just imagined that all colors were actually magenta, but he was just blind to it. Because isn't that what colorblindness was? He did not see a certain color, and instead saw a different color. So he was convinced that everything glorious was magenta, but so was everything awesome and epic. The fact that Bob did not rely on his eyes to see colors, and instead used his spirit sense which saw all colors irrespective of any biological defects his eyes may have was completely inconsequential. In fact, the fact was brown, just like everything else lame and not fun. The tiny captain sitting in front of Bob, his body radiating a power completely immune to Bob's abilities, his tiny arms containing more strength than pancakes, was not brown. No, he was definitely magenta. I have a mission for you, my most faithful and loyal confidant, my utmost trustworthy follower with the best and thickest coat of fur in existence, the captain spoke, his voice filled with unspeakable pain and melancholy. It is a mission I can trust only to you, its importance completely magenta. There are many browns who will stand in your way, who will try to bar you, who will sell their very souls to damnation just to add a single iota of difficulty along your path. But their brownness cannot mar your magenta, and so I must trust only you with this task. Bob felt touched by the captain's trust, causing tears to well up in his eyes. He put his paw over his heart and exclaimed, I swear to the heavens above and earth below, there exists no power in this universe that will stop me from fulfilling your task, Captain. Thou art more glorious than the sun and the stars, more magnificent than Dash. Please, Bob, your eloquence is most magenta, and is the highlight of my day, but you must save your splendor for the arduous task ahead, said the captain, his selflessness shining through once again. Bob had not failed to notice how he sacrificed the things he loved most, listening to Bob, for the greater good. It was most magenta of him. The captain looked Bob in the eyes, communicating untold trust and even dependence. We are on the precipice of a universally momentous moment, the captain said, standing up and turning around. He held his hands behind his back and looked out into the distance wistfully. The very balance between good and evil, between light and darkness, between pancakes and Mondays, is at risk. Forces most insidious connive against us. Bob's heart lurched. No, how can it be? He asked helplessly. How can they connive? Oh, it most certainly can be, the captain said. They are definitely conniving, and there is only one way to prevent it. You must gather your power, accumulate it to the utmost of your ability, and save it. When we arrive in the Arctica realm, you must use your impeccable vision and see through its weakness, pinpoint the exact event that would cause the greatest repercussions, and allow it to unfold. It is critically important that such an event doesn't lead to mass slaughter or harm, but it is equally important that it causes waves throughout the universe. Do you think you can do that? The weight of all that was good and holy in the universe fell onto Bob's shoulders, bathing him in a color even more magnificent than magenta. He was now, baby pink. Fret not, oh Captain, my Captain, Bob exclaimed, bowing so deep his forehead hit the floor. I will complete this mission, even if it costs me my life. With those words said, Bob, progenitor of the drama cats and member of Jack's pirate crew, the deity of entropy, and sugar rushes, first of the drama cats, destroyer of Mondays, and savior of pancakes, walked out, burdened with glorious purpose. The universe would never be the same again, he swore it. Jack, who was left in the room, looked at Bob oddly. For some reason, he had a feeling that the conversation he had with Bob, and the conversation Bob had with him were two entirely different conversations. He just hoped that Bob would remember what Jack had told him. For their arrival into the Arctica realm, he told Bob to cause a small, barely noticeable disturbance so that they could gauge the effects of his words on that realm before planning out a much larger disturbance later on. That way, Jack could first focus on becoming an immortal, and then he could focus on speeding up the birth of the Nexus item and setting up a way to gain access to it. Somehow, during that time, he also needed to find a way to transfer the Chamber of Rebirth from Lex to Jack, alongside a single drop of blood from Lex, without any actual interaction between the two. He wanted to use blood from his main body instead of his fairy body because, well, he was kinda attached to his main body, as well as with the identity of being a human. With that done, Jack sat back down, cross-legged, and began to meditate, working on strengthening his mind. He would need all his mental strength to overcome the burden of his stench once the dragons left. Unseen to Jack and Bob, a purple-colored dwarf dragon sat in the same room, observing everything Jack said and did. Contrary to what his name suggested, Pride was not too prideful to spy on a mortal fairy to learn its secrets. It wouldn't go out of his way to learn them, but he wouldn't refrain from it either while the fairy was in front of him. The fairy's sudden interest in causing universal unrest caused it to feel a little curious. He could also do a couple of things to make that happen. He wondered why it was so important. Chapter 1637, Not the Adversary He Deserved. There came a period of time where, oddly enough, Lex had little to do. He himself was trapped in Abaddon, so it wasn't like he could travel around much. He set things up so that as soon as the award ceremony ended at the inn, the next event would kick off. In fact, marketing for the cultural event had already begun. Before the actual culture event was initiated, there would be a month's time so that if anyone needed to set up, they could. This would allow them to travel to the inn, practice their performances, prepare any necessary ingredients or materials, and generally do whatever was required to ensure a good show. The spin that the inn would put on this was that just as the Midnight Games displayed the military might of numerous communities, this event, formerly called the Cultural Circus, would share the cultures of those communities. It was an attempt to foster friendly relations and a chance to spread their culture and tradition across the realm. While not as exciting as watching battles, Lex expected that this would get just as much viewership as the Midnight Games if not more. After all, already there were many humans formerly from Earth who were adapting countless movies and books into plays for a live performance. Some were designing new video games, and others were compiling songs. There were many other regular guests of the inn as well who were preparing for the upcoming event, including even the paladins, who Lex paid closer attention to these days. Obsidian was developing fine as well, though the number of members were disappointingly few. Although it made sense to take precautions, and not just teleport somewhere random. They were beginning to take up some of the quests Lex had left on the board, such as submitting random information in exchange for some points. But that was about it. They were still very cautious, and none of them had discovered a way to leave their hill yet, which is why most of them were unable to meet each other. So what this meant was, Lex had nothing to do, no urgent task hovering over him. With the inn officially closed to the rest of the universe except the Origin realm, and its many security measures in place, no one was bothering him, so there wasn't too much pressure on him either. So, Lex made the most of his situation. He allocated certain parts of his mental processing power to cultivating, other parts to researching karma, and other parts still to comprehending lawcrafts. There were parts of his mind that he allocated to studying the laws of Abaddon, hoping that might help him understand this place a little better. That left him with only a moderate amount of free mental power. Of course, that moderate amount was only moderate relatively speaking. Even so, Lex decided to take things easy and he only focused on 3 things, alternating between them. He chatted with the guests at the tavern, learning more about the insects and their communities within the jungle. When he wasn't doing that, he explored the jungle itself. Despite not containing nearly as many valuable treasures as the inner jungle, the outer jungle was still a treasure trove even greater than the Midnight Realm. More than once he found fruits that even his body craved, which was an incredible feat. Multiple times he encountered items which his dragon senses told him were valuable, or items his instincts were attracted towards. As if that was not enough, he even ran into an item that improved his system functionality an entire 0.5%. The crazy part was that the item wasn't even hard to find, nor was it protected by some incredibly strong monster. He wasn't even prevented from taking it by the jungle or the mysterious figure or anything. So basically, searching through the forest regularly for treasures became a part of his routine. But the thing he spent the most time on was trying to create his seal. His headband, while fashionable, was quickly wearing out. He needed to create a new seal for himself, or accept the fact that he was about to enter the heaven immortal realm. If such a thing was inevitable, then so be it. But Lex still had things to do as an Earth immortal, such as helping out Vinii, the phoenix in the crystal realm, or kill that accursed craven known as Belial. If there was one thing Lex was good at, it was seeking out revenge, and Lex still hadn't forgotten the pain Belial had caused him. Ben had moved on from his wife's miscarriage since she was healthy, and the fact that they eventually had another kid. But Lex did not forget. The only reason he hadn't already gotten revenge was because Vinii had asked him to hold off on it. However, if Lex couldn't stop his cultivation from increasing, it would not be the end of the world. After all, the Crystal Realm was also on its way to accommodating heaven immortals. As it so happened, Lex wanted to increase his knowledge about how realms operated. Worst case scenario, he'd just have to study how to raise a realm's level on his own. So Lex fell into a loop, transitioning between 3 activities to keep his mind fresh. Meanwhile, Z, who learned from Cayman that Lex had showed up once more, fully healed, narrowed his eyes. The fact that Lex had returned meant that Z was missing something, prompting Lex to show up again. If things continued this way, and Z didn't step up, Lex would surely increase the difficulty of his training. But what was there to do? Ever since the insects became guests of the tavern, there had been no threats, and Z had been tasked with dealing with threats. But Lex had come back anyway. This only meant that there was a threat Z was not detecting, one that would only grow more serious the longer it was ignored. After a few hours of thinking, Z left the castle and explored the jungle, yet found nothing. Even so, he trusted his gut and kept exploring. Days passed, and the longer he found nothing, the more anxious Z got. That is, until, one day he ventured to the edge of the jungle and found him. The Dark Knight. His training partner. Not the adversary he deserved, but the one he got, anyway. He had been waiting right at the edge of the forest, and somehow, he felt stronger than last time. Fortunately, Z was stronger too. Chapter 1638, Luther is not an evil man. You came at last, the knight said, staring towards Z. I thought maybe your courage had waned after experiencing Abaddon. The loser asking the winner if he lost his courage. Now that's something I haven't seen before. I'd say it's pretty courageous of you to show up in front of me once again after I beat you up. The Dark Knight shook his head. You don't understand. I have nothing to lose, and nothing to do. I want to see the person with the aura of Earth. I want to reminisce, to ask him about the planet I used to call home. Then I want him to die. Why should he be free to roam the universe while I am trapped here? He must become a prisoner of Abaddon as well. This time, Z shook his head. No, you don't understand. You think I'm depriving you of what you want by standing in your way? No, I'm saving you from a much worse fate. Not that it matters what you think. Since you have decided to make an enemy of the Midnight Inn, then I will be the one to deal with you. Deal with me? You think having background music makes you guaranteed to win? Within Abaddon, I am immortal. Kill me 1,000,000 times and it matters not. I only need to succeed once. Infinite reincarnations is a crutch for the weak. I don't need to be reborn to defeat you, I can do it with a single life. While they exchanged words, Z was also scanning the surroundings, ensuring there was no trap waiting for him. It seemed that the knight could not, or would not enter the jungle. But that is not a reliance Z wanted to depend on. This was training, and that meant he had to face it head-on. Last time, I was in a rush so we couldn't fight properly. This time, let's see if you can still pressure me. A lot of Z's combat strategy relied on building momentum, and the more momentum he raised, the stronger he would be. But of course, such a thing took time. Now that there was no rush, it would be a proper fight. You are not the only one who was holding back last time, said the Dark Knight. He waved his hand, and from the ground a golem horse made from stone emerged, serving as the knight's mount. The two stared at each other for a moment, and then clashed. Now Luther was not an evil man, far from it. He was kind and attentive, and every worker of the inn had felt his care and attention. But a man had to have hobbies, and plotting the death and destruction of all his enemies was a pretty decent hobby in his opinion. After all, it kept the inn workers safe, and removed future obstacles from their path. For a long time, that planning came in the form of designing a prison in the inn for captured enemies. The problem was, no one dared to mess with the inn, so they hardly ever captured enemies. In the end, the prison was, ironically, being used as a spa for creatures who were born in a fiery environment. It was safe to say that such a plan could, more or less, be considered a bust. Then the innkeeper sent him on a mission to tame the planet Abruptly, and have it produce dungeons for the entertainment of the inn's guests. It was basically impossible to tame a planet in the celestial realm for him. He did, however, dominate Abruptly's psychology, suppressing him using the innkeeper's reputation and influence, making it easier for it to accept the innkeeper's superior position. During the process, Luther himself explored many of the dungeons, and found them interesting and challenging, as well as rewarding. It seemed like, even if Abruptly wanted to, he couldn't withhold the reward for completing a challenge in the dungeons. All he could do was increase the difficulty of said dungeons. As it happened, while testing out a hell-themed dungeon, Luther had gained quite a lot, much to the dismay of the planet. Not only had Luther gained hellfire, he had also gained a blueprint for creating a miniature hell. He'd heard that the turtle was creating a heaven inside the inn, and thought that maybe he could work on creating a hell. After all, the inn was not biased towards any one side. Besides, while heaven had many benefits, hell was not without its own advantages. The most difficult part of creating a hell was finding a conceptualized torment. This was not a physical object or item, and was very much an abstract existence that could only be encountered by luck or chance, and never artificially created. Compared to heaven, which could be grown from a garden, hell presented a different, although equally difficult, challenge. This was something he wanted to discuss with Lex, since Lex had a lot of experience with these things. But he seemed preoccupied with their ongoing task. Luther had to admit, he was impressed by the Midnight Inn. He'd heard of guests coming to hotels, but he'd never really heard of a hotel or an inn traveling to a guest who was unable to leave their location. Now that he was in Abaddon, he could understand why it was important to bring the tavern to them. The innkeeper had probably been paid directly by the condottiere for this service. Little did he know, the innkeeper had not been paid at all. The system was simply accommodating the expenses for all basic services as a part of the ongoing quest. If the innkeeper wanted to earn something, he had to go out and gather his income himself. But that aside, Luther had been thinking long and hard about the conceptualized torment. He was not entirely sure what it was, or how he could find it, when it randomly occurred to him that all of Abaddon basically just seemed like one massive hell, and was probably filled with conceptualized torment. Probably. Now, normally, the rules of Abaddon made it pretty difficult for him to leave and search the lands on his own. But this jungle, it presented him with an opportunity. So, one day, after gathering a lot of information on the jungle from their insectoid guests, he asked Lex to take over in the Great Hall for a bit. Luther was now on the hunt for some conceptualized torment, and once he found it, he would begin work on manifesting that concept as a hell. Chapter 1639, Snow White. A week, then 2 weeks and then 3 went by, and yet nothing changed. Lex managed to temporarily strengthen his seal, but encountered a huge issue. There was both internal pressure, from his cultivation and tenet, and external pressure, from the laws of the universe themselves. It was as if Lex had crossed some invisible threshold, making it so he was ready to view and interact with those laws that he could not sense. Those laws, in turn, seemed almost excited to interact with him, but since he had not entered the next realm, they softly nudged at him, helping him move to the next level. Lex suspected that this feeling is what helped those immortals with a more normal experience enter into the next level. Either way, although he could reinforce his seal, he discovered that the pressure his seal faced increased exponentially. Every day that he did not break through, his internal and external pressure increased. He estimated that, currently, his seal could support him for 27 days. He needed to improve the seal before then. Lex also discovered, amazingly, that the longer he resisted the pressure to enter the next realm, the more the laws of the universe tried harder to increase their compatibility with him. This was not about facing increased pressure to enter the next realm. Rather, it was about how easily he could control or influence laws. In essence, the longer he resisted, the stronger he'd be once he broke through. Even if he did nothing else to raise his power, merely resisting for a longer time would improve his strength. So, he focused more and more towards the seal, spending less time and mental power on studying anything else. During this time, Z kept fighting the Dark Knight, and Luther kept searching the jungle for something. The preparation phase for the cultural circus was still ongoing, with many looking forward to its initiation in one more week. 3 weeks passed by, and so much happened, yet at the same time, so little happened. Lex recalled the time when every day, if not every hour, brought him so many new challenges. He was not reminiscing in melancholy, merely observing the change in his mentality and perception. Weeks passed by, and yet he felt like it was nothing. He imagined that even if years passed by, he would fail to feel their weight. Time had lost meaning to him. It should now be measured in the number of significant events rather than duration. Or not. He wasn't picky about such things. But eventually, a significant event finally occurred. The Jolly Rancher, with the dragon Greed at its helm, reached the Arctica realm. The 7 dragons had planned for a proper grand entrance. Instead, they were taken by surprise by the laws of the realm. The 7 dragons were instantly teleported to the level solely for Dao Lords, meaning there were no weaklings for them to show off in front of, although one could argue that all new Dao Lords were weaklings in front of the dragons. To the owners of the realm, the arrival of the 7 dragons was no surprise. After all, they had sent a letter of intent, as was proper, before arriving. This meager amount of basic courtesy was given since they came with good intentions. It was everyone else who was taken by surprise by the presence of the 7 dragons. The 7 dwarfs had not left the folklore realm since the incident with Snow White. Even those who did not know soon found out that Snow White was the name given to an artificial ice age the dragons induced in a major realm, causing it to become uninhabitable by any non-ice affinity being for billions of years, causing severe loss to countless organizations and nearly instigating a war. Even that was nothing compared to the chaos they caused when they messed with the alchemist Du Metal Complet, a being considered to be at the very peak of the Dao Lord realm. Or the time where they hijacked the faith of hundreds of deities, inserting their stories inside their theogonies, creating an infinite feedback loop to strengthen their own lore. Fortunately, the laws of the folklore realm didn't extend to the rest of the universe, so their plan ultimately failed, or the consequences would have been disastrous. Or the first time they caused an incident called the Snow White Incident, where all 7 dwarfs fell in love with an ice elemental called Snow White. Or the time. The stories were endless, and all of them were bad. Nobody knew the exact details of how the dragons had been persuaded to enter into seclusion, returning to their realm, finally allowing relative peace to return to the universe. Of course, the dragons weren't nearly as bad as an entity like Wukong, who was considered a taboo among Dao Lords. His arrival here would have incited an immediate war, or an immediate escape, possibly both. They were, however, considered very troublesome nonetheless. It could almost be said that their very arrival to the Arctica realm was like causing a stir within the upper echelon of the universe. "Oh no," a Tao Lord whispered, one who had personally witnessed all 6 snow-white incidents throughout the history of the dragons' lives. "The Arctica realm is a realm with a strong een and cold affinity. Don't tell me, there's going to be another Snow White." A chill suddenly went up the backs of several Tao Lords, regardless of whether they actually had any backs to begin with. Greed, who was most looking forward to the bombastic entrance they had planned, looked forlornly at Jolly Rancher, which had come to this level with them. Without an audience, what was the point of keeping the ship? Sure, by mortal and immortal standards, it was a decent vessel. Valuable too. But to a Tao Lord, well, it could not even incite the greed in Greed's heart. With a wave of his claw, he sent the ship back to Jack, thereby cementing the story of how Captain Jack had once given a ride to 7 Tao Lords, and causing a legend to begin. Another stir was caused, since now there was a ship which had ferried Tao Lords, and it was now in the hands of a mortal fairy. The karma associated with that ship, the value, the absolutely unprecedented history of it. If they weren't right under the noses of the Tao Lords, perhaps countless beings would have cast aside their pride and attacked Jack for it already. Previous Index. Chapter 1640, Charisma King. Jack was meditating when he entered the Arctica realm. He had no warning that anything was about to happen. He had, in his mind, shared everything he knew about the Arctica realm with the Tao Lords. There was no reason for them to not know that upon arrival into the Arctica realm they would be separated into different levels. How was he to know that Envy had purposefully hidden that information from his brothers just to cause a little mischief? Not that it mattered whether they knew or not. The Tao Lords had basically no interaction with Jack since their departure, and there was no reason for them to warn him ahead of time that they were about to arrive. So when he was suddenly thrust into the Arctica realm, he was not really surprised. What did bother him, however, was the lack of his ship. It was gone. He had arrived within a landing pool, a pool of cool, refreshing liquid meant to capture those entering the Arctica realm to ensure that they didn't accidentally end up somewhere that would harm them. After all, compared to immortals, mortals were a lot more fragile, and needed a lot more care. After gathering his bearings, Jack swam out of the pool and looked around. His entire crew was present and accounted for, even if they hadn't landed in the same pool. Yet his ship was missing. Jack felt a regretful twinge in his heart, as if he had lost a valued family member. But it wasn't like he could just walk up to the Tao Lords and ask for it back. Maybe in the future, when he was also pretty strong, he could somehow get it back. "Form up," said Jack, addressing his crew. They hadn't come here to sightsee, no. They had come here to take on the trial that was unique to the Arctica realm, and use it to break through to the Earth Immortal realm. As it happened, many members of his crew had odd or unique restraints, meaning that they could not progress through realms with ordinary means. The crystal alligator, for example, had only just been born, and if he were to rely on his natural bloodline to grow, it would take thousands of years. Or he could rely on absorbing crystals, which is how he cultivated, but that would be expensive. Passing through the challenge in the Arctica realm sounded easier, or at least, quicker. Jack gave Bob an odd look. The drama cat was, for once, keeping his mouth shut on his own. He wore a somber look, and didn't seem like he would open his mouth even if his life depended on it. Such behavior made Jack suspicious, but now was not the time to probe the destroyer of Mondays. "Don't cause a scene. We're going to stay low-key until we get our bearings. It would be best if we can take the challenge to the next level without attracting any attention whatsoever. We don't want any obstacles." "Don't worry, boss," said Pebbles, saluting Jack. "We won't attract any attention at all. We'll blend right in with the locals." Jack looked at the hamster and said nothing. For once, the hamster had all its limbs, and even its eyes and ears. No, what was missing today was its entire torso, and in its place the hamster had a thin stick, as if it were a stick man. Or, well, a stick hamster. "Good. That's the spirit," said Tiny Sparkles. "You hear that, alligator? No causing any problems. Tiny sparkles and the crystal alligator stared at each other, challenge evident in their eyes, but Jack couldn't be bothered to look into it. Slowly, but surely, the nauseating smell that accompanied him was returning now that the dragons were gone. Even though Lex had learned so much about karma recently, Jack had no idea how to get rid of the smell. The crew quietly left the building, not attracting any attention whatsoever. They were only a few amongst a crowd of millions, so it made sense that no one paid attention to them. Then it happened. Bob smiled, as if he sensed an opportunity. Jack sensed danger, but he couldn't react in time. The Jolly Rancher, with its massive frame that was huge even by normal standards let alone for a fairy, suddenly fell from the sky, ushered into the level with a heavenly phenomenon. Rainbow appeared in the sky, birds began to sing, flowers began to bloom, the Wi-Fi speed shot through the roof and the ping for all video games became -1. The whole level was attracted to the sight, their greed provoked. But the ship was not meant to be theirs. No, it arrived right in front of Jack, and landed softly. "Thanks for the ride, little fairy," Pride's voice boomed from the ship, alongside the faintest bit of its aura, declaring to the universe that the Dow Lords had hitched a ride on a mortal ship. Jack, who was stunned by Pride's aura, and overwhelmed by the changes the Jolly Rancher was undergoing, could not move nor could he speak. To his absolute horror, the next voice he heard was Bob's. "Behold, mortals, the magnificent Captain Jack, his very presence a gracious gift upon your existence," Bob's voice boomed across the entire level, reaching even those who were so far they could see nothing other than the shine given off by the Jolly Rancher. Conqueror of the river Styx, slayer of gravity eels, taxi driver to Dow Lords, and the charisma king of the folklore realm, these are but some of the titles he boasts on a normal Tuesday. Oh Lord have mercy, don't even get me started on his titles on a Friday. All eyes in the vicinity fell onto Jack, his handsome fairy body standing silently at the bow of the Jolly Rancher, fairy dust glimmering in the wind behind him, looking as cool as an ice cream sundae. He has come to this realm hiding in the shadow of Dow Lords, if only because it was the only way to hide his own brilliance, for a purpose most magenta. Bob, of course, knew that Jack's purpose was to remove the karmic curse on his race, and had the common sense not to say such outright. He would never say that and interfere with Jack's plans. That's why he found the perfect distraction, so that the universe would never know his real purpose. As it happened, a magenta ore, one that remained largely undetected across the Arctica realm, suddenly began to shine, revealing itself to the whole universe. Bob smirked smugly. Yes, his speech was most magenta. Chapter 1641, First Public Appearance. Jack had regrets. Of course he had regrets. Admittedly, he kind of anticipated that Bob would screw things up. He even thought of finding Bob and telling him specifically what to say. Their entire history up until that point had led Jack to believe that Bob would, in some way, screw things up. So why did he go ahead and tell Bob to cause a stir anyway? It was simple. Jack thought it might actually be kind of fun. Looking back, every time Bob caused a scene, it was absolute chaos and sometimes even nearly killed them. But looking back, it was also a lot of fun. What was a little challenge here and there? What was the point of life if all he focused on was working and not having fun? After all, he'd decided to do all the serious stuff as Lex, while living slightly more carefree as Jack. After all, unlike Lex, Jack had no pressure weighing down on him, such as the threat of his being discovered as an unguarded treasure trove. At most he had that pesky karma weighing him down. So, he decided to let Bob let loose for once, and have a little fun along the way. Now, he very much regretted that decision. He had signed up for some fun, and a little inconvenience. He had not signed up to let everyone in the universe know that he, as a mortal, had interacted with a Dow Lord. Of course, one could see that as an amulet of protection. Who would mess with a person who had proven ties to a Dow Lord? The answer was, anyone who had a bone to pick with that particular Dow Lord. In that regard, the dragons had left no room for any doubt. It was an absolute certainty that they had many who had a bone to pick with them, but didn't actually dare to mess with them. In such a situation, Jack could become a decent alternative. Even so, Jack did not expect to face immediate trouble. No matter what, it would still be foolish to target him. Who said the dragons wouldn't retaliate if something like that happened? No one. But, as if that was not enough, Jack had now publicly received his own ship, a ship which had now carried 7 Dao Lords across the void. The mere touch of a single Dao Lord, let alone 7, was enough to transform the Jolly Rancher into a remarkable treasure. This was not an exaggeration. Jack had already learned, through Lex's experiences, that anything and everything related to a Dao Lord was absolutely out of this world and perhaps even beyond their comprehension. Now what would happen to a ship, one that Jack had specifically designed with the intention to traverse the universe, once it carried 7 Dao Lords across the universe? Neither Jack nor Lex had any idea, but they were about to find out. Fortunately, the laws within the Artica realm were special. The Jolly Rancher was immediately restricted by the level it was in, limiting its growth to that of a mortal item. That meant that the Jolly Rancher could, at most, be an item with the power level of the nascent soul realm. That also meant that the ship would have an extremely robust foundation, so that it could easily transcend the limitations of the mortal realm, and easily grow stronger when it was needed. Jack, standing atop the ship, could feel the changes happening beneath his feet. He felt the wood grow stronger, the gold become an even better conductor of spiritual energy, the crystal become harder and more difficult to break. Not only did the sails also grow stronger, they gained the ability to restrict just the wind. They could now be pushed forward by currents of energy as well. As if that was not all, Jack felt the cannons hidden beneath the deck grow stronger, and felt the crow's nest become mysterious, as if able to see through not only the distance, but the future as well. Jack, due to his connection to the ship which he had nurtured with his own fairy dust, felt each and every change as he was stuck there. But those in the surroundings just looked on as the Jolly Rancher, a behemoth of a ship, underwent numerous changes to its appearance and aura. They could only begin to guess the changes that were taking place, and even more, could only guess in their hearts the background and origin of the fairy standing definitely in front of the entire realm. His handsome yet solemn expression as he looked out at them, ready to accept all challenges, made him seem powerful beyond his realm. Many instantly decided to either befriend him, or stay away from him, not risking becoming his enemy. Some, however, had impressive backgrounds of their own, and weren't so easily deterred. Those could not help but feel a sense of challenge welling up inside their chest. They could feel it. In front of them was the protagonist of the era, the defining character who would challenge conventions, make history, and have his name written down in the annals of time. Maybe, just maybe, he would become a legend too. Before any could challenge him, however, it happened. A magenta light rose up from within the ground, passing through everything solid, and filled the very air, as if announcing its presence to the universe. Many dropped to their knees instantly, though since they had been facing the Jolly Rancher when the light erupted, it looked like they were kneeling in front of the ship, and in front of Jack. Bob, who looked out at the scene before him, raised his head with pride. He was not surprised by the shining of the light, nor the kneeling of the people. It was only right. The captain had made his first appearance in public since the crew was started, and this would only be the first of many. Bob looked towards the others, to see their reactions, and felt immense satisfaction to see their surprise. Then he noticed that Goldilocks was missing, and a trail of gold footprints went out into the distance. Bob shook his head. The others really needed to stop causing trouble for the captain. It was most brown of them. Chapter 1642, Gold Eggs. As the aura of the Dao Lords waned, and Jack once again regained the ability to move, a solemn expression filled his face. It was not because he had advertised to the universe that they should rob him because he had immense treasure. No, his expression changed as a result of the magenta light. He felt from it a power he was all too familiar with. It was divine energy. But unlike any other divine energy he had ever felt, it did not belong to anyone, nor was it associated with any being, as it had been self-generated from certain ores. As someone who had been learning about treasure manufacturing lately, and had some experience in handling divine energy, Jack could instantly tell that this ore would be extremely useful in crafting and creating divine items. He could imagine how a powerful treasure, specifically designed to enhance some aspect of a deity, could take the power of that deity to another level. Bob, for example, could cause untold havoc by merely speaking. Now imagine if he had a divine megaphone. A normal treasure, and a treasure which could generate and use divine energy were not in the same realm. Even others, who were not deities, could make use of treasures that harnessed divine energy. He guessed that the appearance of such an or was not a part of the Artica race's plan. Or, if it was, then they were making a grand statement to the universe, and were using this as an opportunity to demonstrate their power and resources. Either way, he needed to take advantage of the situation, and his newfound reputation, to get his hands on some of that treasure. He had a feeling that it would be quite difficult to get his hands on this or pretty soon. "You all stay here while I have a word with our hosts," Jack said, his voice audible in the surroundings, keeping up the facade of a powerful and influential figure. "There's been a small change of plans. Captain." "Goldilocks ran off while we weren't looking again," Tiny Sparkles said, feeling a little guilty for not keeping an eye on that troublesome duck. "In that case, quickly go and find Goldilocks and bring him back. Make sure he doesn't get into trouble." Jack looked around, and noticed that they were still being observed by everyone. Without caring, he released the Jolly Rancher's anchor, parking it in its spot. The anchor, too, had been upgraded, and served as a defensive device of sorts. Not only would it park the ship in its location, but it would also keep out unapproved people from the ship. Of course, the power of the anchor was limited to the nascent soul realm, but within this level, that was more than sufficient. Jack flew off the ship and approached the administrative office where the local guides for the level would be. This close to the entrance of the level, this office was likely filled with those responsible for ensuring safe and stable entrance into the realm for the foreigners and to keep an eye on them. Even so, it would have to suffice for Jack's purposes. Despite the attitude he had displayed outside, as soon as he entered the office, Jack became perfectly friendly and approachable. He walked up to the receptionist and asked to see whoever was in charge of the area. His request was vague, since there were many staff members in the building, each with very specific roles, but soon enough he found himself in a cramped office shared by 3 workers, each of them sat at their desk overwhelmed by paperwork. "How can I help you?" asked the Director of Land and Mineral Oversight. "I just arrived in your realm, straight out of the folklore realm with the big guys. Anyway, I'm looking forward to learning all about you guys, seeing as how we're likely to become allies in the future." I couldn't help but notice the magenta light, and quickly figured that it's related to some ore. Now, as far as I understand, this entire segment of this realm has been segregated for us foreign visitors, right? If that's the case, I was wondering if I could get a permit to mine some of this new ore. It's caught my fancy a little. The rule of law was a very big thing in Artica, and he wanted to cover all his bases before he began his operation. His gut told him that there was going to be a big hullabaloo caused by this ore, and he wanted to make sure that he acquired it legally, so that the Artica race wouldn't take it back from him. As he expected, there was no problem with him mining and exploring the resources within the permitted zones. After all, the whole point of the New Age Expo was to show off everything that the Artica race had. After filling out a whole lot of paperwork, and understanding the legalities of mining, he got the permit. When he exited, he fully expected that his crew had not found Goldilocks. To his immense surprise, they were all there, Duck included. They wore incredibly guilty expressions, as if they were hiding a secret, but they were all there. "What happened?" Jack asked. "Nothing. Not a single thing," Longbeard answered forcefully. "Shall we head out, Captain? Got things to do, right?" Jack narrowed his eyes for a moment, but then shrugged. "Get on board." "We're going mining," he exclaimed, flying to his ship and lifting the anchor. Within the highest level of the Artica realm, Pride watched Jack with interest. His existence at this level afforded him the privilege to control lower levels, although the Artica race had strictly forbidden them from doing as much. Any attempt would be immediately detected, and they would be deported from the realm. Even so, it allowed Pride to at least watch everything from afar. He turned to look from Jack towards a mortal farm where an entire field of crops had been turned into gold. A number of hens sat atop eggs of gold, and a laundry line filled with undergarments had become a statue of gold, a permanent addition to the farm. After all, no mortal should be able to harvest nether lily gold. Chapter 1643, The Treasure Hunt. "All right boys, here's the deal," Jack said in a whisper as he gathered his crew together in one of the newly enchanted rooms of the Jolly Rancher. "We have an official permit to mine special ores, but as a condition of the permit, we have to submit 40% of all the ore we gather to the taxation office." "Ah, I get it," said Longbeard, running his hands through his beard. "We're going to commit tax fraud. Very white collar of us." "No, nothing like that," said Jack, rolling his eyes. "Listen to me guys. It's very important that within the Artica realm you don't break any laws. The Artica race is very particular about that, and they always have Dow Lords watching. We can't keep secrets from them." The crew's faces suddenly went pale, and they looked towards the Goldilocks, who was staring at his own reflection in a sheet of gold. Jack cleared his throat, ignoring the very obvious signs of their misdemeanors, and focused on the task ahead. "Listen to me. Submitting 40% of our harvest was an option I opted for myself because that way, the license I got allows me to mine anywhere, excluding cities, inhabited areas and private property. Basically, the license will glow, letting me know wherever I can mine. The important thing is, we have an edge against everyone else. Everybody is going to want to get their hands on the ore, but not everyone will have a legitimate way to get it, at least not in the beginning. That's our advantage. We're going to make use of the rules and laws of this place. So this is what we're going to do. Ollie, you're on lookout. What you have to do is..." Jack quickly explained the plan to everyone. It was relatively simple, so he didn't expect any of them to have any problems understanding their roles. At first some of them were a little upset at the lack of tax fraud, but as soon as they heard Jack's plan, they quickly got on board. They were simple beings, and had simple tastes. They liked to rip off people. Was that so much to ask? Jack shook his head dismissively and focused on flying the ship, chasing the magenta light. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like the existence of this ore seemed too good to be true. But if that were the case, why hadn't anyone stopped him? Why hadn't they taken the opportunity to prevent him from getting a license for that ore? The only thing he could think of was that no one else realized how valuable the ore was. That seemed almost impossible. The second possibility was that they thought it was not as valuable as Jack seemed to think it was. That was likely the correct guess. Whatever. Lex had an entire realm at his beck and call, and Jack had a cool-ass ship that could now probably travel the void. Treasures and resources weren't something he was seriously lacking in any version of himself. So if there was an ore that even he found interesting, then Jack wasn't going to care what others thought of it. The ship, for which Jack had already procured the appropriate licenses, flew silently over the land, drawing attention from all who saw it. None had approached Jack so far, but news of Jack, the Dow equivalent of Uber Black, had already spread through the entire level. Everyone recognized his ship, and many had actually begun to follow him from a distance. Everyone was wondering what he was doing, and some were planning out how they would treat him. After all, the unusualness of his situation was evident to all. Fairies didn't typically attract so much limelight, so the fact that this one had made him special. In that case, reporting him to the enemies of the humanoid alliance might be more valuable than befriending him. Jack didn't care. He simply focused on finding the ore. Despite the light covering the entire level, the actual quantity of the ore was not so abundant. Jack was actually using Lex's experience with treasure hunting, and his knowledge of glyphs, to mimic a dragon's ability to sense treasure using his own fairy dust. The effectiveness of the ability was, naturally, significantly weakened. But there was no other solution at the moment. In fact, Jack wasn't the only one searching for the ore. Regardless of what the Dow Lords thought of it, an ore that could cause a phenomenon across an entire level was no doubt valuable to mortals. As such, numerous groups, organizations and individuals had set out for the treasure hunt, but actually finding the ore was easier said than done. Of course, not many of them had the foresight to get a permit for mining either. It was a race to see who could find the ore first, and who could gather most of it. Naturally, the citizens of the Artica realm itself had the greatest advantage, but they left the area designated for foreigners alone. Jack, of course, was not content to leave things as they were. Besides using his own means to find treasure, he also made use of his secret weapon even if its actual effectiveness was yet to be tested. The crystal alligator had an unusual fondness for treasures, and had on more than one occasion fought with tiny sparkles over the allocation of their loot. Jack couldn't really be bothered to rein him in, especially when he had much more troublesome crew members to oversee. Now, though, it was a pretty good opportunity to see if he really could ferret out treasure. So, the alligator was taken to the crow's nest, which had been magically and mystically enhanced. Then the waiting game began. As the ship flew over the land, the hours started to roll by, and the anticipation only grew. Impatience began to grow within the crew, and Jack, who was being affected by the stench of his own karma, wasn't in the best of moods either. Then it happened. It wasn't Jack nor the alligator who sensed something. Instead, it was Bob. Chapter 1644, Perchance. Now, Bob was a deity, and no matter how hard they tried, it wasn't easy to forcefully keep his mouth shut. The alternative that the crew found most effective was to simply keep his mouth busy, so that he would not be able to use it to talk. Some routine ways in which they did that was through the use of jawbreakers, or basically any kind of food, making him blow bubbles, a silence competition, playing breath-based musical instruments and telling him that silence was golden. On rare occasions, they froze the space around his lips, forcing them shut, or threw him into an illusionscape where he thought he was speaking, or maybe, if they were feeling especially bold, ask him questions to which he couldn't possibly respond with something absurd. There was this one time they crossed the river of death and cheated reality itself to approach 7 Tao lords, just so that they could contain the repercussions of his speech. Some argued that since the safe environment in which he could speak was only a positive side effect, and not the intended purpose of their trip to the Tao lords, they couldn't really claim that as something they did to protect themselves from his words. Jack argued that since it happened, and it worked, he was going to milk it for all the credit he could get. Of course, there were also times where their attempts to occupy him failed, and he spoke as he wished. Like the moment he discovered the ore. For once, Bob's signature smile faded from his face, and an unbearably serious expression replaced it. "Verily, I have seen disaster on the horizon," Bob said, his voice suddenly deeper by a few octaves, almost as if it were a different person speaking. Jack suddenly turned to look at Bob, but the drama cat was actually looking towards the distant horizon. The tomes recording history will mark the day as the one where hope died, and the day the light dimmed. Yet unto you I impart this knowledge. History will also record this day as a day of miracles, where aspirations were met, and dreams came true. The weapon of the future has been revealed, and her name will be Faith. The last word Bob spoke had an unspoken weight, one that Jack recognized all too well. It was the weight of a secret of the universe. To learn those secrets one would normally need to be at a higher cultivation level, but none in his crew could be called ordinary by any means or standards. Well, technically, if the standard was the amount of craziness required to join his crew, then yes, all his crew members met it, and were thus quite ordinary in that specific regard. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, walking up to the drama cat. Bob turned to look at Jack, his eyes carrying an unfamiliar solemnity. But it did not last long, for clarity began to fill them as he looked at Jack. "Oh Lord, Captain, oh Lord. I thought of your wisdom like the sun, shining light onto the world, imparting enlightenment and sustaining life. Oh how I was wrong. Clearly, Captain, your wisdom is far greater. It is only now I realize the threat of this or, yet you had sensed it already, and already made plans for it. Surely you already know of what I speak, so let me translate the rays of your brilliance down for the rest, that they may drink from the spring of your knowledge." The crew all turned to look at Bob, though not to listen to him talk about drinking from the captain's knowledge. It was rare for him to speak so much so coherently, though coherence might be used liberally in this instance. You all may be trapped in shadow, but fear not, for I shall slay your ignorance just as I slayed Monday. Jack didn't want to tell him Mondays still existed on Earth, so he kept quiet. Deities cannot depart from the realm they are born in, that is a fundamental law that establishes the foundation of all pantheons. Suddenly, the whole crew was alarmed. How could they forget? This was actually somewhat common knowledge in the folklore realm, where deities were extremely common. Everyone knew that deities were restricted to the demi-dao lord realm, unable to grow stronger, and that they could not ordinarily leave the realm where their pantheon is based. Leaving that realm would not only result in a huge decrease in power for the said deity, but would partially cripple him or her until he returned. But Bob was. Well, Bob was Bob. None of them were going to question him, though it was fairly obvious that he was most certainly not crippled. "'Tis the reason why the universe is at peace. 'Tis the reason why pantheons fight and tolerate one another. 'Tis the reason no one deity spreads their influence from one realm to a different one. What would, say you, happen to this dynamic were a divine autarky artifact come into existence? One that does not rely on worship or ritual to sustain itself? One that can pull its own energy out from the air?" Silence. A deafening silence filled the Jolly Rancher, mostly because none of them knew the answer. "Quack," Goldilocks said, turning its head sides. "Exactly," Bob roared. "It can be like a seed, nay, an autodynamic apparatus used to spread the foundations of any pantheon across the universe, infinitely, forever." Suddenly, the most unkillable existences in the universe become even harder to kill. So long as a single follower still exists, a single source of faith, they will live forever. "A whole new resource to farm from the countless realms," Jack suddenly said, understanding dawning on him. "The deities will invade the weaker realms, not for anything else, but to proselytize." Jack frowned. "No, wait, that wouldn't make sense. A bunch of demi-dao lords could never declare war on other major realms, nor could they genuinely compete with other powerful organizations. However, he could see how certain powerful organizations might want to spread the influence of deities associated with them. Perchance, were a deity to create more than just an artifact, what might be the consequence? Perchance, what if they were to create another body? Perchance. 1645 The Facade of Balance. Jack resisted the urge to twitch his lips at Bob's constant use of perchance, and instead focused on the content of what he was saying. He hadn't said it outright, but it was definitely what he heavily insinuated. He also heavily insinuated that the appearance of this or might result in a number of universal wars, but Jack didn't think it would be so easy to destabilize the universe. Sure, deities were impressive, but the hard lock on their cultivation meant that they would never become the peak powers of the universe. That did, however, mean they were the perfect members for countless powerful organizations. Nearly invincible, unkillable beings near the Dao realm used to fill in numbers and do their bidding sounded like a mighty good deal. In that case, these organizations might engineer situations where the deities within their own organizations grew a larger following across the realms. Sure, that might cause some friction between organizations, but Jack did not think it would extend to the level of universal war. The chances of wars, invasions, or crusades in smaller realms was a lot more likely though. Jack personally found such a possibility highly annoying, not only because it put the Midnight Realm at greater risk, but because his personal enemy was likely to become even harder to kill. The last thing Bob said though. "Will that allow deities to leave their realms?" Jack asked. He didn't care if it broke his image as an all-knowing captain. This was too important to not ask about. But he should have known better. Instead of thinking that Jack didn't know the answer, Bob felt like Jack asked so that his crewmates would be enlightened. Bob's legs quivered as tears welled up in his eyes. Such a noble heart, such noble intentions, oh Lord, what did we do to deserve so much care? What did we do? The tears started to stream down his face as he shut his eyes tight, unable to behold the benevolence of the captain. Seeing that Bob was unable to speak, Tiny Sparkles spoke up. "The universe likes balance. Or at least, the appearance of balance, he said, his voice deep and reverberating as normal. Deities were made as near unkillable as a thing could get, but in exchange a heavy restriction was placed on them. They could never achieve the Tao, and they were forever stuck within their realm. That means that if their realm doesn't mature, they won't even be able to reach the peak of what the divine path allows. For a moment, Tiny Sparkles stopped speaking, as if struggling. Eventually, though, he sighed, and spoke. Take me, for example. The universe made me small, and gave the unicorns, a race born near perfection, never suffering from sickness or ailments, their first ever instance of dwarfism. In exchange for my smaller, stunted size, as compensation, I grew an incredibly powerful and potent horn, so much so that I was able to pack more energy into my body than any other unicorn in existence. So what was originally a system of balance, where I gained one flaw in exchange for one benefit, became a broken system where I attained unimaginable power. The restriction on deities seems very much like the same thing. At a glance, the restrictions seem like flaws in exchange for extremely potent abilities, but as the universe grows, and more possibilities come into existence, those restrictions can become invalid. It's very likely that if a deity can make another body using this ore, they really will be able to leave their realms sooner or later. After all, this ore seems to generate its own divine energy. If that's the case, it will solve the crippling issue that deities face once they leave their realms. Jack pursed his lips, then turned towards Bob. Can you sense the location of the ore? He asked. Verily, I can find it even with my eyes closed, Bob said, pointing in a certain direction. Excellent. In that case, while we cannot do tax fraud, it doesn't prevent us from war profiteering. We need to get our hands on as much of this ore as possible. This is going to be big. Oh, and we should also get some to add to the Jolly Rancher. That'll be our first order of business. While the crew immediately set out, approaching the ore at breakneck speeds, certain beings had already come to understand the effectiveness of this ore. The Artica race seemed uninterested in the ore at first very much because they knew that deities could not approach the Tao realm. But soon, even the Artica race learned about the influence of the largest collection of demi-Tao lords in the universe. Pride, of course, only watched all of this in silence. How interesting it was that this happened right after they arrived in this realm. It was as if Jack's purpose of causing a universal stir was a lot more thorough than even Pride realized. Or he was just lucky, which was also just as fascinating a possibility considering his horrendous karma. He closed his eyes and summoned a small piece of the very ore that Jack and the rest were on the hunt for. He studied it with great intrigue. There already existed within this universe divine stones, which were similar to spirit stones except they contained divine energy. But this ore, which revealed within itself the ability to replenish its divine energy, was new. It was interesting, but as a being at the very peak of the Tao Lord himself, interesting is all it was. Instead, he turned his attention back to Jack. Secrets that could be hidden from even him, and his brothers, were far from simple. He was too prideful to forcefully reveal them, but he didn't mind testing things every now and then. Pride channeled a hint of his power into the ore in his hand, and then flicked it away, immediately causing it to leave his level, and enter Jack's. What happened next, he would watch with great interest. Chapter 1646, Leave You with a Full Corpse. The sudden boost of speed by the ship allowed the crew to lose the crowd following them, which meant that as they followed Bob's directions, they ended up being the first ones to find the ore, with no one in sight to compete with them. That was fortunate. After using the license to ensure they could dig in this area, the crew immediately got to work drilling through the ground, reaching for the ore. They didn't have much time. A massive wooden ship out in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly inconspicuous. Jack kept lookout, just in case anything unexpected happened, or some competitor showed up. To his immense surprise, nothing happened. Within a few minutes they found the ore, though the entire deposit was about the size of a large fries from McDonald's. Well, that was easy, said Monk, the bear cub who had been silent recently. As the universe had just been waiting for him to speak, the sky suddenly changed colors, attracting everyone's attention. A large, magenta meteor shot through the air, its familiar aura raining down on the planet, as it attracted everyone's attention. "That's not ore, that's refined metal, ready to be used," Ollie exclaimed in shock. "Boys, it doesn't count as mining as long as we catch it in the air," Jack exclaimed, and jumped back onto his ship, immediately taking flight. He gave the first chunk of ore to Bob, after putting away the taxable amount, of course. Like a rocket, they blasted off the surface of the planet and aimed for the shooting star. Jack, for a moment, couldn't help but think back to that one shooting star that had started it all. Then he thought about how, back then, he too had said something careless. Now he couldn't blame a random wish for everything that happened subsequently, but one could not ignore the similarity between his current situation and what happened back then. Could Monk's words really have raised a flag? For a moment, Jack's belief wavered. But then he shook his head. No, it was impossible. He didn't believe in flags. It was pure happenstance. "Captain, other ships have been detected targeting the shooting star," Ollie said, reporting from the crow's nest. "Boys, I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure what the rules are about aerial combat here. There's a chance we might end up in jail for this, but, no matter what, we have to get our hands on that shooting star." Instead of being intimidated by the threat of imprisonment, the crew seemed excited by the notion of fighting for treasure. Jack also stopped worrying about the consequences. He was sure there was some leeway or diplomatic immunity that they were afforded. More importantly, no one stopped him or told him otherwise, so technically speaking the blame wasn't on him. Feeling a tinge of excitement about taking his new and improved Jolly Rancher into battle, Jack began flapping his wings, allowing his fairy dust to fall onto the ship, transforming it. For a split second he was distracted. Even Jack felt a trace of pity for Z. The poor kid wanted cool transformations and multiple attack forms so bad, but even his ship already had multiple forms, while he was still struggling to create his own. Truly was a pity. The sails of the Jolly Rancher transformed, turning into wings that mimicked Jack's, while a faint, glimmery sheen covered the ship, similar to his fairy dust. With a clap of thunder the Jolly Rancher seemed to teleport, ripping through the air and appearing right beside the shooting star. Jack couldn't leave the helm, so Longbeard used his beard like a lasso and grabbed the prize right out of the air. That was definitely new. Did the beard grow longer when Longbeard flung it out? Before Jack could figure out the answer, a number of ships in the design or regular planes or spaceships, not like the Jolly Rancher, managed to reach, and surrounded them. "Hand over the prize and I'll leave you with a full corpse," someone shouted from one of the ships, disdain dripping from the voices. He genuinely seemed to think that such a threat would work, for he then waited for Jack to hand over the item instead of attacking directly. Yet upon hearing the threat, instead of cowering or feeling angry, Jack actually felt excited. "He said the thing!" Jack exclaimed, before ramming the Jolly Rancher right into his ship like a battering ram. Courting death, he roared when he saw Jack make a move. Unfortunately, what the unnamed scrub did not know was that he was the one courting death. "Bob, let them know who this prize belongs to," Jack said. Bob, with a smirk, as if he knew this would happen, cleared his throat, took a deep breath, and then yelled. "Off fools most fragrant with folly. Before you stands not a man, not a myth, but a fairy. A maelstrom in mortal flesh. Behold! Captain Jack. Yes, that Captain Jack. The one whose shadow frightens storms into silence, whose glare has shattered oaths and melted arrogance like wax beneath the noon sun. Dost thou, perchance, wish for death? You dare unsheath defiance? Against him?" Were the two gravity eels, turned to gold while still living, their writhing pain forever immortalized in their figures, that pull the ship, too warm a sight for you? Or perhaps you too wish to decorate his vessel with your mortal bodies turned to gold? Oh, how brave you are, oh how brilliantly doomed! For you stand before a legend draped in leather and dash. "Oh shut up," roared a beast as he quickly pulled his ship back. The Jolly Rancher had directly ripped through its first target without slowing in the slightest. What happened to those on the ship was anybody's guess, for they were too busy pulling back from the ship to pay attention to that. Amidst the critical life and death moment, where they were now facing a foe much stronger than they anticipated, hearing an over-the-top speech was extremely grating. Unfortunately for them, interrupting said speech would result in a far worse outcome than mere distraction, as they would soon come to learn. Chapter 1647, The Deity. Honestly, Jack was not paying too much attention to what Bob was saying. Although every word he spoke was a potential disaster waiting to happen, Jack had noticed that praise did not seem to have any effect on him or the universe at large. For example, Bob calling Jack a being of supreme power made no difference in reality. So as long as he was singing praises, the consequences of him speaking could be managed. This was a rather advanced way to control what Bob said, and could not be recommended to amateurs or those handling a bob for the first time. So as he used his ship like a celestial sledgehammer, smashing through ships, and his crew members ran below deck to man the cannons and test them out, the only thing he paid attention to in regards to Bob was whether or not he was paying compliments. Therefore, Jack missed when Bob was interrupted, and he missed the expression Bob made when he was interrupted. In Jack's defense, his fairy body, while incredibly strong, was not an immortal, so it lacked the depth of awareness that Lex had. Bob's signature smile faded, slowly, and it was replaced by the most horrendous scowl. The hairs on Bob's body stood up, making him look like a very angry cat. Then he hissed, and leaped forward. Space bent. It did not break, nor did it become disfigured, or put a sprain on its surroundings. The space within a major realm was not so easily broken. But it bent nonetheless, as if it was elastic, also that it could aid Bob in moving faster. When the deity of chaos struck first, none understood what happened, including Jack. One moment there was a ship, manned by an armed group, resisting the debris from the ships the Jolly Rancher destroyed. The next moment, the entire ship was gone, and its place a black void, as dark as midnight, as silent as the depths of space. Jack felt, for a moment, that he was looking at a black hole. But that was not it. The attack had not sucked away the light, nor had it created darkness. No, reality, within that space, ceased to exist, leaving nothing but a true, genuine void. Jack's brain could not comprehend nothingness in its true fashion, and so it replaced it with the color black. A devastating, indescribable fear spread across the skies as everyone rushed to get away. They had no idea what had happened, and they did not want to find out. Jack, who finally saw Bob and realized what had happened, looked at the drama cat oddly. Jack had, on multiple occasions, fought with and even beat up Bob. It was nothing personal, he'd beaten up everyone in his crew. It was almost every week when one of them tried to become captain and replace him, so he had to constantly put them in their place. Not once had Bob ever revealed strength anything like this. Come to think of it, Jack had hardly ever seen Bob use divine energy or his deity powers. A fraction of a second passed by, and the deity of entropy attacked. Instead of erasing reality, this time where his body passed, everything seemed to break down. It did not stop working, no, not that. Not did it shatter into pieces. No, everything broke down into more fundamental forms of matter. Shimmering lights represented the energy released from their bodies, holding them together, now freed. Ships turned into sand, bodies turned into carbon, whales turned into wind. Everything was happening too quickly. No one had time to react, to retaliate, or even defend. The deity of sugar rushes attacked once more. Rainbows and sparkles erupted and a ship exploded, making it look like tiny sparkles had struck, but that was far from the case. Fortunately, though Bob unleashed hell and hail fury on his enemies, he did not reveal the power of the destroyer of Mondays. Perhaps the travesty that had been committed was not yet serious enough to warrant such wanton destruction. The battle had only just begun, and yet it was over. Not a single cannon shot was fired, much to the dismay of Pebbles, who had grabbed a matchstick the size of his own body, ready to light the fuse. Bob returned to the ship, feeling quite embarrassed as he had revealed his unkempt state in front of his crew members. "A billion pardons for my hair," Bob began to say, but Monk couldn't care less. Bah, fellow Taoist, you have robbed me of the opportunity to deliver mercy. How can I go to hell if I don't kill people? What am I supposed to do if others go to hell? It is clear that I am supposed to suffer, so others may benefit. But the dead can't benefit, you should have at least left one alive. Though Monk spoke softly, as if he were a real monk, the agitation and frustration in his eyes was evident for all to see. You could have at least let me fire one shot, Pebbles complained as he leaned against the matchstick, a forlorn expression painting his face. Yeah, Bob, I wanted to test out the ship's abilities, said Jack with a disappointed expression. Although Jack appeared nonchalant, he silently admired the crew's ability to not be intimidated by Bob's power. Truthfully speaking, the crew had spent some time together, and had overcome some obstacles, but Jack had never questioned any of them about their past, and it was uncertain if they wanted to stay as a part of the crew forever. He personally felt it was unlikely. It wasn't as if they had sworn some great oath to stay together. They had joined his crew under very casual circumstances, and Jack was prepared for a day where they might leave just as easily. Yet while many things could be faked, such camaraderie could never be faked. None seemed scared of Bob's power, and in fact, treated him as truly one of their own. Maybe it was because his every word wasn't so lethal these days. Had he learned to control his power? Jack doubted it. Just as the crew was hassling Bob, and Jack was wondering if he should examine their prize, another shooting star shot through the sky, this time farther away in space. Chapter 1648, New Deity Title. The timing was too coincidental. As soon as they finished the fight, the next shooting star appeared, leading them further away from their planet and into space. Jack could say with a certain degree of certainty that they were being led somewhere, but he could not imagine where or why. He turned towards Bob, who was combing his hair and patting it down. "Do you want the refined metal?" Jack asked, giving him the first pick. It wasn't just because he had been the one to fight off the attackers. It was a number of factors that played a role, such as Bob's perception and detection of the metal. "It is a holy item for many, but 'tis merely a paperweight for me." "I do not need it," Bob said, dismissively. "Besides, I have no interest in matters of faith or following. I took upon my mantle to protect my fellow drama cats, but ever since I was knocked out of my realm, I no longer bother with it." Jack raised an eyebrow. Just moments ago they had concluded that the next great wars would be fought over faith to empower deities, and here they had a deity entirely uninterested in faith altogether. Well, whatever. In that case, since Bob has forfeited his claim on the metal, the first claim shall be Jolly Ranchers. We will first improve the ship with as much of this as it can absorb, allowing it to wield and control divine energy, before our individual shares. I, as the captain, obviously get the first share. Does anyone have any issues with that? Pebbles had an issue with that, so Jack put him inside one of the cannons and sealed the lid shut. The hamster was pretty much impervious to damage, so being shot out of a cannon shouldn't be a big deal. Not that Jack planned on actually shooting him out of a cannon. Probably. Maybe. It depended on how he felt. Since no one else in the crew had any other complaints, they set off after the shooting star, starting one of the greatest disturbances caused in the New Age Expo. Their crew, which quickly earned a reputation as being both formidable as well as despicable, earned the nickname Tiny Tyrants. That was because, in general, but especially in comparison to their own ship which seemed like it had been made for giants, the entire crew was tiny. The fact that the captain was a fairy, and the first mate was a unicorn with dwarfism seemed to signify that the entire crew followed a theme of beings with small physiques. They also learned, very quickly, to never disturb one of Bob's monologues. In fact, that particular reputation spread so quickly that Bob, who was entirely uninterested in accumulating faith, began to accumulate faith related to his monologuing. It was as if, every time he spoke, all conflicts would stop, all disasters would pause, and the universe itself was interested in listening to his words. The drama cat lamented his own undeniable excellence as he felt a new title forming for himself. Alas, to be worshipped is the irrevocable burden of the magnificently handsome. Jack found it particularly odd that despite the havoc they were causing, clashing with dozens of powerful forces from across the universe, no one came to stop them. But he took it as a form of silent consent to what was happening. In fact, his guess was not far from the truth. Up in the level for Tao Lords, a number of the Artika race watched the various levels, observing not only the tiny tyrants, but the havoc being caused across the immortal level as well. There were two main reasons they didn't step in to stop the fighting. The first was that their leader, the ruler of the Artika realm, had made a move. None of those who were killed in this conflict actually died, they were instead simply teleported to another place within the Artika realm where they could either spend their time until the next phase of the expo, or they could leave the realm. The second reason was to get a better understanding of the dynamic of the powers across the universe, as well as absorb the thoughts and opinions, as well as gauge the value they all assigned to this ore. For some unknown reason, they could not accurately determine how seriously to take the emergence of this ore. They initially brushed it off, but the levels of activity shown by this ore, from the mortal realm all the way to the Tao realm, proved to them that they were mistaken. But when they considered the fact that deities could not enter the Tao realm, they reduced the importance of it, not quite placing it on the same level as a Tao level resource. But the response from external organizations surprised them, for they almost immediately started to pressure the Artika race to begin immediate exports of it, which obviously wasn't possible. What was especially important was that the Artika race didn't want to set a precedent for giving in to demands under pressure. So they observed the ongoing conflict on all levels, studying the influence of each interaction and using it to extrapolate the hidden potential that this ore had. Considering that the Artika realm was not lacking in actual Tao level resources, the reaction to this ore, which was evaluated to be at a lower level, was highly suspicious. The situation is clearly abnormal, one of the Tao Lords said, referring to the sudden increase in pressure that the foreigners were exerting. There's clearly some information we don't know. We need to somehow gain access to the Library of Heaven, or find someone who is willing to divulge high-level information to us. Compile a list of candidates. Sir, about that. There's a newcomer from a race known as Devils who has approached us. He wants to make a deal, and will give us the information we want in exchange for some high-level resources unique to Artika. What's his name and affiliation? Give me a report. Well, his name is Balaam, and he's affiliated with the Humanoid Alliance. Chapter 1649, Months. Deviating from their original plan of immediately trying to progress their realm, Jack and his crew began to gather the as of yet unnamed ore across the Artika realm, being mysteriously guided by shooting stars ever towards the depths of space. But the time difference made it so that time moved much slower in the Artika realm than realms that hadn't completely matured. Within the Midnight Realm, the cultural circus officially began, but unlike the previous events, there was no rush. This was an event that had been scheduled to last for 5 years, an idea Lex got from the New Age Expo, which was supposed to last 5 years in Artika realm time. Such things were actually far more common in the universe at large than Lex had originally thought. On Earth, back when he was a mortal, the world worked very quickly. In pursuit of efficiency and productivity, everyone was always in a rush, a far cry from life in the older ages, and even in the countryside. But in the universe, things had gone beyond that, and the rate of everything appeared to have slowed down, though in actuality that was not the truth. High cultivation levels meant that everyone could maintain high productivity even while taking things slow. The extremely long lifespan of cultivators meant that for things that didn't include emergencies such as war or fighting, everything was slowed down. In that regard, an event that lasted 5 years wasn't even that long. Lex had even heard that in some places there are entire plays that span several decades, as every moment, big and small, of a character's life are portrayed in an attempt to capture the depth of his or her emotions. While Lex surveyed the inn remotely, he noticed an odd trend, though one he very much appreciated. Fewer and fewer higher-level cultivators came to the inn, for they had something much more relevant to their level to occupy their time. The Champions Tourney, which was very much still going on, was picking up in momentum and starting to really heat up. As a result, there was a gradual trend of lower-level cultivators making up the larger number of guests in the inn. Alongside the targeted services towards mortals, and the 5-year-long event, the inn was about as safe as it had ever been. When he wasn't focusing on that, Lex went around exploring the jungle, finding ways to strengthen his seal time and time again. As a result, his knowledge and understanding of seals enhanced, and Lex was forced to use laws in more complex and creative ways. Many ideas were actually given to him by the celestial insects, who had a very different progression path than humans. They viewed and controlled laws in different ways, so their insight sometimes was incredibly helpful and insightful, and at other times completely a waste of time. Regardless, he managed to strengthen his seal time and time again, but the number of remaining days never grew too large. It seemed he was always a couple of months away from the seal breaking. This was because the longer the seal existed, the more those mysterious laws that remained invisible to him called out to him, nourishing him and improving his control over laws, guiding him deeper into becoming a heaven immortal. Lex genuinely figured that for some people, resisting the urge to become a heaven immortal was a genuine cultivation method used to improve their foundations. He simultaneously studied karma and abaddon, gaining a few insights now and again. He also kept his attention trained onto obsidian. Ever since the beginning, the obsidian sage had not appeared again, nor had he given out any quests. The number of members had increased, but confined to their own islands, all they could do was watch each other from afar, or try to get along with the few on their own islands. Some of them really did try to reveal the existence of obsidian, and they were promptly expelled, unable to return. Such events made the others even more careful about divulging the secrets of obsidian. The knowledge of the secret club's existence was ultimately revealed. Of course, no one mentioned anything about systems. Revealing obsidian was one thing, but revealing the secret about systems was another thing entirely. Systems were a secret that had been kept in the universe for a very long time, which clearly meant the repercussions were far more serious than the repercussions of revealing obsidian's existence. For now, Lex did not intend to do anything else with that club. After all, he'd already given them a mission, which was to find a way to send things to Abaddon. As long as any of their systems allowed such a thing, they'd help Lex tremendously. But progress was slow. Days turned to weeks, and then months. There was no sign of Fenrir and Little Blue, and so the armies remained within the jungle. Cayman hadn't wasted that time either. Not only did he allow his army to heal as much as possible, he tapped into the knowledge of the insects, learning secrets of Abaddon he had yet to encounter. Even though they had never left the jungle, the sheer amount of time they had spent there meant they knew things. They even revealed a way to find some ruins, something Lex had been looking forward to for his own research. Unfortunately, there were no ruins in the jungle. As more time passed, Lex managed to find many valuable treasures, including the flowers that increased comprehension. He gave the first one to Z, who had been struggling to fight the Dark Knight. Then he took one himself, and found it had little to no effect on him. Then he sent one to the gift shop, and had someone give it to the galactic turtle. He even found other treasures to help him improve his system functionality, bringing its functionality up to 43%. Unfortunately, each time a resource was used, it couldn't be used again. Lex collected them anyway, for they might be useful later on. Like this, training, studying, researching, 13 months passed by within the jungle. Chapter 1650, Nyan Cat. Bang. 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 Lex put the hammer aside and wiped the sweat off his brow before looking down at what he had just created. A pineapple. Or rather, a pineapple. It was a personal internal nullification engine for arcane power preservation locking enchantment. He was not the one who named this particular version of his seal, in case that much wasn't obvious already. This was, however, the strongest seal he had created to date, so much so that he put up with the name. Bloody hell, it really works, Lex said, picking up the small engine that looked like a purple crystal. He took a deep breath, and then focused on the estimated time left on his current seal. According to his own analysis, the seal would last another 4 minutes. So, without further ado, he picked up the purple crystal and stuck it on his forehead, providing it with just the slightest bit of energy it needed to power up. The pineapple came to life, fusing into his skin, a huge deal considering how difficult it was to even scratch his skin, and looking like the purple crystal was a part of his body. It hummed slightly as it tapped into Lex's own energy pool, with his permission of course, and started to suppress his cultivation. It was so effective, in fact, that Lex's cultivation was suppressed all the way to the base of Earth Immortal level 9. Based on the current strength of the seal and pressure from his cultivation, it could last a little over 3 decades. "Your design is not bad at all," Lex said as he turned to look up at a blurry figure sitting atop a tree branch. After over a year in the jungle, Lex eventually noticed that every time he ventured into the jungle, he was being watched by some unknown creature. It did not reveal itself to anyone else besides him, and even he could only see a vague outline of what looked like a rainbow-colored rectangle with a tail. Lex had named the creature Nyan Cat. "My design is flawless. Your execution is abysmal. This can merely be considered operational." Nyan Cat was a super tsundere character, who always criticized everything anyone did, but also went out of its way to solve any problems Lex had. As far as Lex could tell, Nyan Cat was the only non-insect resident of this jungle, and just like them, it was taking refuge here from Abaddon's destructive forces. "Well, thanks for putting up with my mediocrity," Lex said with a hint of amusement as he put his makeshift hammer away. He looked down at his miserable state and discovered that he really needed to shower. Oddly enough, while regular heat could no longer cause him much issue, the pressure of working with complex laws made him feel like a mortal who had gone on a 4-hour hike in the middle of a heat wave. In short, it was bad. Over the past year, under Nyan Cat's insistence, Lex had used less of his many abilities, and focused solely on using laws for everything. As a result, his control and understanding of basic laws had improved tremendously, so much so that Nyan Cat reluctantly began guiding him on more complex laws. One day, Lex had asked the cat why it was helping him out. The cat had been brutally honest about its reasons. It was bored. Also, according to it, there was no way Lex should have been able to survive passing through the barrier between the inner and outer jungle, but he clearly had. It had watched him enter, like so many others before him, but he was the only one who came out. That was enough to intrigue it. To be honest, Lex didn't remember much from crossing the barrier, so he couldn't really explain to the cat how he had done it. "Now that I've managed to make the pineapple, do you think I'm ready to start studying Abaddon's laws?" he asked the cat. "Going by your current pace of learning, and your current realm, you are about 1,000,000 years too early to begin trying to understand any laws in Abaddon," Nyan Cat said dismissively. "You'd be better off trying to learn how to hide your soul signatures and positive karma." Lex groaned. He had asked Nyan Cat about the creatures that had come for him, the ones that suffered universal rejection, and why they might be after him. The answer was surprisingly straightforward. If they could steal enough positive karma, they could disguise themselves as beings without universal rejection, and leave the confines of Abaddon. Seeing as how Nyan Cat seemed to know so much, Lex had even asked it about the chalice of the abandoned, but it had never heard of such a thing. Nor had it heard of the Well of Forgotten Dreams. It had heard about a bunch of other things with ominous-sounding names that felt like they had unspeakable secrets, but Lex already had enough on his plate, so he tried to remain uninvolved with them. "You should start heading back to your castle," Nyan Cat said with a distinct tone of disinterest. "I think your friends should be returning soon." "No, these fights usually last a few weeks and Luther already found what he was looking for, so he—" Lex suddenly paused, and then looked at the blurry figure waving its tail. "You don't mean them. Are you referring to Fenrir and Little Blue?" he asked. "How am I supposed to know the name of your friends? But they're coming all right. I just felt the barrier seal up once more. The jungle is going to retreat again. You guys should probably leave before nightfall, or you'll be stuck in the jungle for a long time." Lex took a deep breath, and cleaned his body with a technique, then blasted off in the direction of the castle. Night was still far away, but Lex knew by now not to judge Abaddon by common sense. Nyan Cat simply watched Lex leave, and then faded as if he was never there, undetected by any other living soul in the entire outer jungle.